name's Louis Bickford. I have two questions. The first one is about Chinese foreign investment. Is this on? Can you hear? Chinese investing in Africa in particular, Asia and Latin America. I've spent some time I've made a number of different trips in my life to Kinshasa, for example, and the radical transformation of Kinshasa because of Chinese investment is astounding. And so, you know, what does that come with? In what ways is that monitored, understood, et cetera? And that's just the capital city. I mean, you go anywhere in Africa and you can see Chinese investment. So I'm curious about your thoughts about Chinese investment abroad, and you know, whether we need to think of it. I come from a human rights perspective, so the question is, do we need to be thinking about that in a particular way from a human rights perspective? Second question is more broadly, regionally in Asia, the Asian human rights system, or really lack of. We were just beginning to talk about this during the break. But I'm just curious about your reflections on whether there's any possibility that there will be any kind of serious Asian regional human rights system that emerges. I mean, ACRE, which is the current effort to do that under ASEAN, is pretty toothless and doesn't seem like it's really going anywhere fast. So I'm just curious if there are other possibilities, or you know, whether you think that's worth following more closely or putting any energy into, et cetera.
Well, I'll say a word or two about Africa, whether it's Kinshasa or it's South Sudan or it's any of many other countries in the region. The investment is phenomenal. And with our own policy of sanctions, and having convinced Canadian companies and American companies and other Western countries to pull out, we have provided an opportunity for extraordinary influence by China in those countries. Same thing with Burma. We had China and India doing lots of business there as we all followed the various sanctions. And to a certain extent, recognition of that has brought back a kind of shall we say, more sophisticated engagement. I think Mike could talk to us a little bit about Burma and the China angle. It would be quite interesting in that regard. But China is making friends for China around the world and building leverage and also sources of resources. So from a human rights point of view, this might be seen as a negative development. But you could also see it as a positive development. Mike asked earlier about what about China's leadership on Darfur and Sudan and other countries like that. And the fact that China voted in favor of sending they didn't vote in favor, they abstained, on sending Darfur to the ICC and sending Libya, where they had taken thousands of workers out of Libya during the crisis, that they voted to have Libya be considered by the ICC. And so it was no insignificant development. It was quite a change in their traditional approach to these international institutions. So is it because China is stepping up to the plate as a world power and recognizes its obligations, or is it out of self-interest to protect Chinese and China in these contexts? In a way, it doesn't matter, because what we're seeing is a greater involvement with these systems. So I think that those are important developments. As to the Asian regional system, well, let's see if the ASEAN system again gets off the ground. And again, here's a case where Mike may have some greater insights into this than we do. But the fact that we're seeing China engaging internationally and being concerned about these issues in the region, whether it's North Korea or Burma or anywhere else, is again a different situation than we saw before. China's early years were self-protective. Their goal was to make sure there'd be no criticism of China, no resolutions, no criticism, and that country criticism would be minimized in any way possible. That mechanisms that existed internationally would not be able to enforce rights. You may have universal rights, but you can't universally enforce those rights. And the weaker, the better. So what we're seeing now with the growth of these regional human rights systems is a certain seriousness in some of these areas, and we should be nurturing that, it seems to me, in every such case. And I just wanted to tie into the economic growth model issue question that was raised before very quickly. China's coming up before the Economic, Social, Cultural Rights Committee for a review of its compliance with the covenant. China's coming up in the UN before the Universal Periodic Review in September, October, whenever it is, for review of all of its compliance across the board. China doesn't want to be criticized. Whether it's RTL or it's the economic growth model, this is a time where, shall we say, voicing concern about these issues in other countries, whether it's from the US or South Sudan or Burma or anywhere else, is going to have more influence than it might have at other times. So this is we were looking both for challenges and opportunities. I think this is an opportunity to, both in terms of the ASEAN region and in terms of these international forums where China is coming forward, just as 70 cases were presented and found to be violations of rights in the arbitrary detention working group. If you change RTL, they might not be. It's a time to try to see if that'll happen.
If I can just step out of the chair for 1 second on this subject, a couple of things to say, particularly on Africa. A lot of the Chinese initiatives, the investments in roads, infrastructure projects, the expectations of governments and people in those countries has been, this is going to be an infusion not only of income, resources, but also jobs. And the reality has been something quite different than that, and there's a lot of unhappiness with the Chinese model. The Chinese tend to bring their own labor force, do it their own way. A lot of what they're doing is trying to get access to resources, to natural resources, and they don't do it they don't accompany that with a strategy for development and growth within a sustainable structure. So there's lots of issues. If you talk to, they do an annual meeting where they bring African leaders in to come and talk about their strategies. It's a different discussion today than it was 10 years ago, and there's a lot more anxiety about the way the Chinese are doing it.
And the Chinese are discovering what we discovered long ago, which is when you go into these countries and you inevitably end up supporting local dictatorships and get involved with corruption and their demands, it doesn't sit too well with a lot of the populace if it's a country where people can still express their views. So it's a Chinese involvement, whether in Africa or Brazil or whatever, and it's growing everywhere, stimulated by the need to tie up resources as they see it, it's a mixed blessing for China at most. I want to say that Burma is an example of how the country sensibly doesn't want to be in China's pocket. They want to use us and others to balance Chinese influence. Even North Korea. I remember I went to North Korea first in 1972, and what I learned there was the intense dislike they had, not only for modern revisionism, i.e. the Soviet Union, Russians particularly, but the intense distrust of China. They didn't love China. They don't love China today. They don't like the hand that feeds them. They don't like being reliant on China the way they are. What North Korea is really looking to is to do what Burma did, and it's just much harder for them to see how to get there. They want the US the furthest power away to help balance powers that are on their doorstep. So this is quite a complex thing. Vietnam, despite the ideological, political, geographic, et cetera, factors, Vietnam is very, very wary, of course, of China's influence. So China also, unlike the Western powers, has a harder time when it comes to demands within these countries for greater freedom, because China is seen as abetting, of course, repression by whatever the government is that prevails. Also, these countries increasingly know that if you cross China, if you don't accept what they want, China, despite its occasional statements that we don't mix economics and politics, is capable of very brutal and open economic retaliation. Chinese official who works for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was in Manila just about 10 days ago. He made it very clear, because Manila chose to go to the Law of the Sea Tribunal for the next 4 years or whatever period it takes for a decision to come out of that tribunal. Manila, Philippines, is going to suffer economically, and they've certainly shown that in their relations with Taiwan. Final point on cross-strait relations. Human rights comes up in cross-strait relations now. Ma has done a brilliant job in making 18 agreements with the people across the water who deny him equal standing. Nevertheless, on the basis of equal standing functionally, he's made these agreements, but they don't seem to be able to go much further. And they can't go much further because even Ma's closest advisors, some of whom are my former students, have publicly said, if the PRC can't loosen up on human rights, cooperation across the strait can't go much further than it has. And that's an interesting point.